Almost ready?
Yes.
This is a TPAC Inside Out discussion, a podcast brought to you by the Tennessee Performing Arts Center. Today, we partner with Vanderbilt University for a Zoom call with Dr. Jim Jackson and our arts community to discuss preserving mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And Midori, give us a wave. Midori Lockett is our partner at Vanderbilt University for, many of you know, the Inside Out of the Lunchbox series. But, we're stuck at home. And so instead of, eating together, we decided to forgo the food part but have a great discussion. And so why is TPAC hosting a discussion on mental health? And it's a no-brainer for Vanderbilt because they do that for a living. But what prompted this is some conversations that we've had with artists in our community. And I think most of the people on this call are either artists or arts administrators and people that work with artists. And I feel like, when we first got the stay-at-home order, everybody was doing kind of okay. And then all of a sudden people started losing their jobs. And then people started, realizing that we were going to be home for a little bit longer than we thought. And the conversations went from, whenever we would say, "How are you doing?" people would go, "Yeah, great," to, and I found myself answering that way as well. So I called our friend, Dr. Jackson from Vanderbilt, and I've known him for a long time. And he actually has been a speaker for us before for one of our arts appetizers. But he works at Vanderbilt. And so Jim, before we get started, I'd love for you to let everybody know a little bit about your background and what kind of work you did before this pandemic, and then what your focus is now.
Glad to do that. Kristin. So I'm not much of an artist. I should mention that to start. I was in a play, The Jungle Book, at Portage Central Elementary School back in 1977 or so. And I did write a song for my daughter once called "No, No, and Double No." But that was a phrase she used to like to use. So the song went, "No, no, and double, you're in big trouble. No, no, and double, no, no, no." That's what I remember. So I'm not a gifted artist, actor, songwriter, whatever. But I'm a psychologist, and the work that I do and the work that I've done really for the last 20 years or so has been work that intersects actually with COVID-19. So I'm in the division of, I won't get into the weeds too much with you all, but I'm in the division of critical care at Vanderbilt Medical Center. And so for many years, the research that I have done has focused on what happens to you if you become critically ill and find yourself in the intensive care unit. What happens to your mood? What happens to your brain? What happens to your body? Those are the things that my colleagues and I have been studying. And for many years, people have been quite interested in that research. It's been well funded and we're widely published and all of that. But that research is suddenly gaining new relevance during this season of COVID-19, because many of the insights that we have learned about, if you will likely apply to COVID-19 survivors. That is, they are going to have brain damage, many of them. They are going to have post-traumatic stress disorder that is quite severe. They are going to have something called critical illness polyneuropathy, where they're not going to be very strong and they're not going to have much endurance. So the fact that I've worked with those patients has led me to speak to a lot of intensive care physicians really around the world about mental health. I just happen to be in their, I'm going to date myself a little bit here. I was going to say Rolodex. Some of you are going, "What's a Rolodex? I've never heard of a Rolodex." Kristin has heard of one, though. So my name just happened to be in their Rolodex because I rub shoulders with a lot of ICU doctors around the world. And so I've given presentations about mental health. And as I've begun to talk to mental health, about mental health with medical providers, that role has expanded a little bit. And increasingly, I've been talking to larger groups from a lot of different backgrounds about how to sustain mental health during this COVID-19 pandemic. There are some principles that are solid, and they're well known, and they are going to apply to you whether you are a dancer or an actor or a writer or a doctor or a lawyer, or whatever it is you do. There are some mental health principles that are going to apply, and we'll talk about them in practical ways. There equally are some other issues that cut across regardless of what people's occupations are. I think all of us, and I'll dig into this in a moment, are anxious, right? Some of us more than others. All of us are worried, some of us more than others. None of us are breathing a great sigh of relief that we are in the midst of a pandemic, right? We're all somewhere on this spectrum of distress. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to try to speak very practically to you all about issues related to coping during the pandemic. And you can ask questions if you have them. And additionally, I'll be glad to offer this. If you have questions and you're interested in engaging them a little more fully and you need to reach out to me, obviously I can't provide individual psychotherapy for 100 people or 50 or even 10. But if you're interested in having a one-off conversation with me about some of the things we discussed, I'm really delighted. It really would be my great honor to do that. And feel free to reach out. Kristin will pass on my information. Really happy that Kristin reached out to me. We've been friends for many years, really probably virtually the whole time that my wife Michelle and I have been in Nashville. So with that said, I'm just going to jump in a bit, and I'm going to start with some assumptions, and I'm going to make them pretty explicit. And you can agree or disagree with them, but I think they're assumptions that we're broadly going to agree upon. And one of those is that being alive in the world right now during COVID-19, if you have ears to hear, and that's a biblical phrase, if you have ears to hear and eyes to see, you're feeling some degree of distress right now. Very normal, and it's what one would expect. And that distress comes from a lot of different places, and it takes a lot of forms. So when I interact with people, again, around the world, and I ask them about the sources of distress they feel, they fall into a variety of categories. So certainly many people are concerned about very practical things. That is, I'm really afraid of getting COVID-19, and I'm worried about all of the implications of that. Right now, for some people in New York City or in Detroit or Eastern Michigan, certainly in Italy, this is an ever-present concern, and it's quite a realistic concern. For other people in some remote county in Idaho, right, it may be a less present concern, and yet that fear is often there. And for them, that fear takes the form of what we call anticipatory anxiety. And that anticipatory anxiety is related to, I'm looking over the horizon, I see something that looks like a tsunami, there's a wave in the distance, it might get to me or it might not, but oh my, I am really frightened by that. So some people concerned about active current threats. Some people concerned about threats that are not active yet, but they could be. So that's one category of worry. Many people feeling guilt from a variety of sources. So for some people, that guilt would be as simple as, I seem to be doing okay right now. I have some work right now. I save some money right now. I'm managing right now. I know other people in my social circle, I know peers who are not doing as well. I feel really guilty about that. Whether you should or shouldn't, different question, but many people do. Others feel guilty because they have a neighbor or a friend, someone else who is on the front lines, so to speak, working as a respiratory therapist in the hospital or working as a nurse in the ICU, and the feeling is, oh my gosh, I'm not contributing in the same way they are, and I wish I were. I feel guilty. Moral distress, another really important category, but one that people don't think of very often necessarily. Moral distress being related to things like, this isn't fair, the unfairness of this situation is really repugnant to me. There are dynamics that don't feel quite right morally about what's happening that is creating problems for me. Obviously, financial and work stress. And then the other thing that I think is really worth talking about, because it's a problem, is anxiety over normal things. I talked recently to a physician at a hospital nearby, and he said, I have been so focused, so hyper-focused on COVID-19 that I have really let everything else around me kind of fall by the wayside, and I'm struggling with that. So life hasn't stopped, right? There was a country song from probably a dozen years ago. It was a little bit on the maudlin side, I have to say, although I really loved it. And it was just called Life Happens. Some of you might remember that song. It was lovely in a way, but it was about this notion that whatever else is going on, life happens. And sometimes your plans are derailed by life happening. So many of us are worried about COVID. We're very worried about COVID, but we don't have the luxury of only worrying about COVID, right? We're worried about financial stress. We're worried about our kids fighting at home. We may have had problems in our marriage or some conflict in our relationship even before this happened. This sort of thing doesn't make that better automatically. It often makes it worse. We may have had a wedding we were planning to go to or a trip we were looking forward to, and the hard hours we were working seemed a little more bearable because we knew that when the summer was here, we were on our way to Paris or whatever it might be. That's not happening right now, right? So a lot of anxiety and a lot of grieving, all possible sources of distress during COVID. So issues that are both very practical and issues that you might consider quite abstract. We also know, and it's worth noting, we also know that it may be that artists as a group are prone to being distressed in a situation like this because evidence would suggest, and there's some debate about this, but some evidence would suggest that artists as a group already have high levels, not on an individual level, but on a group level. Artists as a group often are already possessing high levels of anxiety. They're already, in some cases, prone to depression. They're already, in some cases, populated with mood disorders a little more than the general population. That's what we know. What's the relevance of that? It isn't good or bad, but what it does mean is that you may be more vulnerable than some other people to the insults that have been launched by a situation like COVID-19. The other thing that seems very relevant is that at Vanderbilt, or in a lot of occupations at Vanderbilt where I work, or at the VA for that matter where I work, there are formal designated infrastructures to support me or to support my colleagues. There's an employee assistance provider, and there's an office with a sign, and you can find it on a map, and they're going to be really deliberate about trying to help you. But as I understand it, at least, there is not a robust formal infrastructure to support the mental health of artists. There's not necessarily a giant building in the middle of a city that has the words employee assistance provider for artists right over the doorway. I don't know that you're going to find that building. So obviously, Kristin and other people, leaders in your community, are motivated to help you, but there isn't necessarily a formal system in place or a formal safety net that would be as robust as you would like. And I think that's a concern and a challenge. The other issue that I want to launch into is to talk about this notion of warning signs, and we're going to delve into this a little bit. So what have we said before? So far, we've said that there are clear reasons that people would be distressed. We've said that people in the artistic community may have a proneness to be distressed, like other people who are paying attention. And now I want to suggest that one key thing we need to do in this season in our lives is we need to pay attention to emotional warning signs. And we're going to talk a little bit about what they are. I often like to tell a story about, it's not really about a car, it's about much more than a car, but a story about a little old white car that I drove from California to Nashville in 2001. It was a Mazda 323. It was a little old hatchback. Not sure how it made it all the way out here, but it did. And I loved that car. And I drove it a lot. And one day, the warning light on that car came on the dashboard, came on. And I was in a hurry, and I didn't have a lot of money. And I happened to have a note card beside me. Aspiring academics carry those, I guess, with them. So I took a note card and I put it over the warning light, and I just kept on driving. And it actually was, in some ways, it was actually pretty great because I didn't see the warning light, right? I just kept on driving. Problem solved. Well, the problem wasn't solved, right? Problem was not solved. And one night at maybe 7:30 or 8, I was driving down Highway 40 West, headed to our house in Bellevue. We live not too far from the Horsleys. And there's an exit right next to where the Costco is today. It wasn't there then. And my car died by the side of the road. Died by the side of the road. The engine seized up. And the next day I took it to a scrap metal lot. Actually, it was towed there. And I sold it for $50. Okay. So that's my story. So we don't want you, right? We don't want you to be like the people who have a warning light come on and then ignore it, right? Because the more you ignore it, the more likely you are to have a bad outcome. And in the same way that my check engine light came on, all of us have check engine lights of our own, if you will. And for some of us, those check engine lights are not on. And for some of us, those check engine lights are blinking. In some cases, we really need to pay attention to those check engine lights. In other cases, maybe we can ignore them for a while. And we're going to talk a bit about what those check engine lights look like. So if you are a little more grumpy, if you sleep a little bit later, if you feel a little bit more nervous, if you're tempted to kick the cat, which I don't want you to do, right? Those might be natural expressions, right? And those might not be hugely concerning. But if you're inclined to do all of those things quite a bit more than usual, you're not a little more irritable, but you're a lot more irritable. You normally drink a glass of wine 2 nights out of 7, but now you're doing it 5 nights, right? And your spouse has raised this issue with you and has said, honey, you need to back off a little bit, right? And you find yourself being really defensive with them. Or you're obsessing in really unproductive ways and you feel like you can't turn it off, right? Uncharacteristic behaviors or maladaptive behaviors that maybe you've always had, because all of us have them, but they're a lot worse and they're more entrenched. These are warning lights that you really need to pay attention to. And there are a number of ways to attend to those. The best way, if you will, is to try to head off the warning lights of the past, right? By practicing things like self-care. So the analogy with a car would be, if I would have been taking it in for regular checkups, which I never did, never do, then the warning light might not have come on in the first place. So part of what I'm going to suggest in just a moment is that one way to reduce the likelihood of the warning light flashing is to attend to your car, right? To be really thoughtful and deliberate about attending to your car. And we're going to talk a little bit about how one would attend to the car. And I'm going to launch into a conversation about that right now. So under the heading of what we're going to call building resilience and promoting coping skills, I'm going to make a number of suggestions. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to consider is this idea that self-care, practicing self-care shouldn't be an afterthought, but actually should be a priority, right? And the first thing I'm going to try to do here is not to tell you how to do that. There are some ways to do it. But the first thing I'm going to suggest to you is to change your paradigm a little bit so you can actually value this and understand that self-care is really important, right? Practicing self-care begins by a recognition of the importance of self-care as a primary concern, and as I said, not an afterthought, right? It's really prioritizing your emotional needs, giving yourself permission to treat those very seriously, and also, excuse me, I would say, learning to be really kind to yourself. Some of us are extraordinarily harsh critics, right? I tend to be that way to myself. Some of us are quite good at being gentle and kind to yourself. Now is a pregnant opportunity, if you will, to learn to be kind and gentle to yourself. The other thing that I'm going to suggest in the vein of practicing self-care is I'm going to suggest that you consider prioritizing boundaries, right? Prioritizing boundaries. I would love to ask you all, we're not going to do this, but I would love to ask you all how exactly it is that you set boundaries. I'd love to, again, not going to ask you, but I'd love to have you raise your hand and rate yourself on a scale. Many of us across occupations are not very good at setting crisp boundaries. Crisp boundaries meaning I'm focused on what I need. I'm focused on keeping healthy people in my life, right? I'm focused on keeping unhealthy people out of my life, right? I'm monitoring those things. Many of us are not oriented that way. Not long ago, in one of the trainings that I did, a nurse asked a question, and she said, one of my relatives who I really care about calls me every day. So far, so good. And all she wants to talk about is COVID-19. Every day, all the time, all she wants to talk about. So my comment, not brilliant, right? Not genius, was, well, have you considered telling her that you don't want to talk about that? No, I don't really want to offend her. She's really nice. I don't want to hurt her feelings. Well, hurt her feelings, right? I mean, risk offending her. There are ways to say it that are appropriately kind, and it could be as simple as, Susie, Molly, whatever. I don't really want to talk about that. And if you insist on talking about that, I think we're actually not going to be talking very much, right? I don't want to be a jerk, but I don't want to talk about it, right? And that's one form of a boundary. I think the other form of a boundary that is really practical here has to do with things like consumption of the news and consumption of social media, and simply how much exposure you're going to have to what's going on with COVID, right? What's going on with the pandemic, what's going on with the economy. I mean, in case you haven't noticed, there's a lot of bad news out there, right? Like there's a lot of scary news. I just started on Twitter. I just joined Twitter just recently. I actually have been really surprised by how mean people can be. I don't know if my head had been in the sand for a while or what, but there's a lot of bad news out there. And you can get, I don't want to overstate, but you can get as upset and anxious about COVID as you want to be if you're immersed in the news. So this is one intervention that we talk about that is both really simple and powerful, and that is be very deliberate and be very intentional about how much media you consume. And probably consider some practical things like I'm going to receive my news from 2 or 3 trusted sources, places that are not hugely inflammatory. I'm going to check the news at 8 in the morning, and I'm going to check it at 8 at night, and I'm going to limit it to 5 minutes. And very simple sorts of behaviors like that, and they can go a long way, because part of what this constant dynamic of being on our phone all the time following the latest news about COVID can do is it can keep us emotionally activated. It can keep us hypervigilant all the time. And this is what we don't really need, right? Because, and here's the point, because we really can't do anything about it anyway, right? We can't do a lot about it anyway. So psychologists who practice cognitive behavioral therapy, and I've been the recipient of some of that, maybe some of you have too, they make a distinction between what they call productive worry and unproductive worry, okay? Simply stated, productive worry is worry about something I can influence. It's worry about something that I can do something about, right? So I can worry about my exposure to COVID, and I can decide as a result of that I'm rarely going to go to the store, that I'm going to go to the store at a time when few people are going to be in the store, and that when I go to the store, I'm going to wear a mask, right? So I can worry about that. I can do something about it, right? But this sort of global, sort of diffuse worry and anxiety that keeps getting churned as I'm influenced by every news article I read, there's nothing I can really do about that, right? That's unproductive worry. So what we want to do is we want to be open to productive worry. We want to try to decrease unproductive worry, and we want to acknowledge on some level that there are some things we can't have control over, don't have control over, and we need to try to make some peace with that, if that makes sense. One example that I can think of where this has come up, I have elderly parents. Does anybody have elderly parents? Some of you are raising your hand, right? Does anyone have stubborn elderly parents? Yeah, I do. A few of you do, yeah. So I have stubborn elderly parents who actually don't act very stubborn when I talk to them. They act really lovely. And then I think when I hang the phone up, they're as stubborn as can be, right? Because they totally dismiss everything that I've said to them about being careful and being safe and all of that. And that's just the way they roll, right? So I worry about them a lot because they have underlying health conditions like many of your parents do, and they live in Michigan and all those things. Well, I've had to accept that I can only do so much, right? Short of stuffing them in a car and driving down to Michigan and locking my mom and dad in our house, right? I can only influence what they do to a certain point, right? And I can't worry about them, but I've got to release that on some level because they are going to do what they're going to do, right? So this is the idea of worrying about things that we can control and trying as we're able to let go of things that we can't control, right? What's going to happen with the economy? That's something we really can't control at the end of the day, right? Making productive choices right now to help bolster our finances, that's something that we can control, right? So I buy a lot of stuff, not expensive stuff, but I buy a lot of stuff on Facebook Marketplace. And that's been a weird thing lately because you drive somewhere, meet someone, they put something over in a field somewhere, they leave it and drive away, and then you go put your gloves on, pick it up, put it in your car. It's weird deal. So, right? So recently I thought, wow, this $600 used grill, this is a really good deal. I would love that. I'm home, got a lot of time to spend with that grill. Wow, but $600, that's a lot of money. I don't really need it, right? I don't need it. So that's me asserting control, right? I mean, that's me making a good decision that is going to better my financial bottom line. So in times of uncertainty, and we're very much in an uncertain time, one key to coping is to try to find out what those things are that I can wrap my head around. what are the things that I can actually control, and control those, right? Work to control those and influence them. And then begin to be comfortable with the notion that there are just things that I can't control. Social support is another area that is really important as we think about coping and building resilience, right? Social support. Leaning into that as much as we possibly can. There's a great book that I really like, not really a light read. It's called Bowling Alone. Does anyone know that book, Bowling Alone? Not that many people seem to know the book. It's pretty dry, but very famous, written by a Harvard sociologist, Robert Putnam, 20 years or so ago now. And Robert Putnam observed that it's kind of a cultural history, this book of community in the United States. So what Robert Putnam, who's a sociologist at Harvard, what he observed was that there are a lot of people evidently these days who are bowling alone. They go to the bowling alley, that they're bowling alone. What he also observed was that back in the day, in the 50s and 60s, fewer people were bowling, evidently, but nobody was bowling alone. Okay, and it's sort of touching thought and sort of interesting. This idea that in some ways our culture, our community has become quite individualistic. Bowling alone, I think, sums that up. So I don't want you to do COVID-19 alone. Okay, I don't want you to do the pandemic alone, and you should resist doing the pandemic alone, right? Every study that we could find, every study I could point you to, would say in general, more social support is better, less social support is worse. Now, we've got probably on this call people represented from across the spectrum. We may have some super hyper extroverts, and that's sort of where I probably fall, wearing out my family, my friends. And there are others who are probably really profound introverts on the other end of the spectrum. And we don't need to, I'm not advocating for introverts to try to morph into extroverts and extroverts to morph into introverts. Not at all. I am suggesting, though, that now is the time to lean into these social networks, right? Now's the time to connect with people that are meaningful. Even if it's been a while, you might be surprised by how dear they still are to you. And now is the time, if you have needs, to consider being vulnerable, reaching out to other people and expressing those. Sometimes the reason people are not meeting your needs is because they're actually not aware of how much you're struggling. And I'll give a really short example of this. So again, 25 years ago or so, my wife, Michelle, and I moved to California. I was in graduate school. We both were really in California. And we were trying to find a church in a little town called Yorba Linda. Actually, not so little, but a little town called Yorba Linda, where the Richard Nixon Museum is, interestingly. But anyway, neither here nor there. We're trying to find a church, and we found this Sunday school class, and we started attending, and nobody was friendly. Didn't seem friendly at all. And one day we were headed to Yorba Linda. We were driving down Imperial Highway, if anybody's been on Imperial Highway in Orange County. And my wife was crying, and I remember her saying, "Oh my gosh, Jim, if nobody speaks to us in that Sunday school class for like the 15th time, I don't think I want to go back to that church anymore." And I kind of felt the same. Well, we sat on the front row of this little Sunday school class, and the teacher took prayer requests, as they were prone to do at the beginning of the Sunday school class. And I thought, it's kind of now or never. Like, this is not really working for us. So it's now or never. I'm going to be a little vulnerable here. And so I raised my hand and I said some version of, you guys don't really know me. I'm Jim Jackson. This is my wife, Michelle. We've been coming here 4 or 5 weeks. And that was all fine, right? That was not too hard to say. The hard part was then to say, and we are really struggling, and we're feeling really lonely. And, by now Michelle was crying. I was about ready to start crying. We're feeling really lonely, and we're really disconnected. We're feeling really needy. I felt like I had just kind of taken all my clothes off and just exposed myself, hard to be that vulnerable. And I was deeply touched by the outpouring of love and support that people gave to us. Somehow they really had not understood how needy we felt like we were. And when we articulated that, they were really responsive, right? So if you're having a hard time and people aren't rallying around you or supporting you, it could be that they just aren't very lovely people and don't sort of, give a damn. But it could be that they don't really understand the magnitude of your needs, right? And Brene Brown, who writes about these topics very eloquently, and I would commend her to you if you haven't read her stuff. Brene Brown points out that actually courage and vulnerability is not that they're opposite things. They're actually two sides of the same coin, courage and vulnerability. So I would encourage you to consider being vulnerable about what your needs if you haven't been, and become more comfortable getting vulnerable. The other thing when we think about building resilience and coping is simple things like exercise, what we call sleep hygiene, and diet, right? And this falls under the heading of learning to be really intentional, okay? So consider living right now during this season with more intentionality perhaps than you have, and consider prioritizing engaging in some regular self-care behaviors, even if you haven't in the past. So those could include going to bed at the same time and getting up at the same time. Those could include going on walks regularly. Those could include working out. Exercise isn't a magic bullet, but it's pretty close. Now, even as I say that, I actually don't do it that much, so I'm aware of the hypocrisy there. But exercise is incredibly helpful, right? It helps our cognition. It helps our mood for some people almost as effectively as an antidepressant or therapy does. In some cases, it's something that you can do in a community, even as you're socially distancing. So exercise is really important, and is diet. But more than that, I would say just learning to live intentionally. The other thing that I'm going to mention that I think is really important is this concept of a parking lot. Okay, and here's what I mean by this. Most of us, I think, would say that our resources are greatly depleted during this pandemic. That is, our emotional resources. And for many of us, depending on our situation, the goal is survival. Now by survival, I don't mean, oh my gosh, I literally don't think I'm going to survive this, although some people may feel quite that way. But I mean, most of us are not necessarily trying to thrive and excel during this pandemic. Many of us would say we just like to get through it, right? And that's probably where I am now. I initially had really grand plans. I was going to learn, 14 new languages, and I was going to lose, 50 pounds, and I was going to compete in an international CrossFit competition or whatever. I was going to learn to play the violin. I was going to build a pizza oven in my backyard, even though I have no idea how to do that. I've never attempted it, right? All this stuff. Quickly became clear that was a little grandiose, right? And I'm going to invite you guys to modulate your expectations a little bit, but I'm gonna also invite you to be okay, to consider being okay with the bow, whatever the bow is. I'm going to invite you to consider being okay with the bow not being tied up and not being sewn up, right? And I'm going to encourage you, I normally wouldn't as a psychologist, but I'm going to encourage you to say, you know what, we can kick that can down the road right now, and we can deal with that a little later. We actually don't need to deal with that right now. Here's an example. I don't know if my wife actually loves being an example in all of my presentations. I need to talk to her one day about that. But we have a really good marriage. We've been married 27 years, and we have a really good marriage. But there are 2 or 3 issues. I don't know how many people here are married or have a significant other or partner, but there are 2 or 3 issues that if we really dig into them in depth, we probably are going to arrive at a conflict. And I don't know if there are other people who have a few of those, like hot buttons. Like, we can talk about your parents, but oh my gosh, we better not talk about mine, because I'm going to get really defensive, or it could be anything, right? So recently we were having a conversation, and I really don't even remember what it was about, but it was clear that we were not going to agree, right? We just were not going to agree. And we were going to have a fight probably if we engaged in this. And I said to her, I mean, again, not brilliant, just practical. You know what? We really are not going to agree on this, right? Right. And I know we want to get to the bottom of this, right? Right. And this could cause us a lot of distress right now, right? To try to open this can of worms, rip that scab off, right? Right. So let's just decide that we're going to kick this down the road. We're going to put it in the parking lot. And when this pandemic is over, we'll deal with it because it actually is really important, but we don't need to deal with it now, right? And that applies in a lot of contexts, right? Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe the bad study habits my son is using at home right now during this pandemic, right? Well, now is not the time to have, now is not the time to develop an IEP, an individual education plan, right? Now's not the time to ring the school counselor up and say, hey, could we come in, little Johnny for the next 2 weeks? Can we figure out how to give him a little better material? He's really gifted. Can you figure out how we can do this or that? Or he's really struggling, right? Now's the time to kind of say, man, I'm not all that comfortable with this normally, but it's sort of okay right now. I'm going to demonstrate what is called psychological flexibility, and I'm going to be okay with things, right? I'm going to be okay with some things that I normally might not feel great about. I'm going to set the bar in some areas of my life maybe a little lower than I normally would, and I'm going to practice extending grace to myself instead of being the harsh critic that I normally might. And I think that's a really important paradigm. The other thing I'm going to suggest is I'm going to suggest the use of some practical techniques that are potentially going to help us, and they relate to anxiety and specifically to leaning into anxiety as opposed to avoiding it. And I think this concept is really important, right? So many of us, me included, when we feel a lot of uncertainty or we feel a lot of anxiety, our inclination is to try to run away from it or push it down, right? Like, I don't want this, I don't like it, I'm going to try hard not to think about it. Well, it's a truism that the more you, and this has been studied in what famously was called the white rabbit experiment, which maybe some of you have heard of. And in the white rabbit experiment, participants were asked not to think about a white rabbit. Okay. Any idea what happened? Emily, you're smiling. Anyone have an idea about what happened? Exactly, right, exactly. They kept thinking about the white rabbit, right? That's the way our brains work, right? The harder we try not to often, the more we do. So ironically, the thing about anxiety is the more you sort of say, I'm going to push it down, I'm going to push it down, I'm going to get away from it, the more it sort of follows us. Ironically, the more we lean into it, though, the more that anxiety actually dissipates. So it's pretty fascinating that it works that way. And again, it's really counterintuitive, but that is the way that it works. So I'm gonna invite you guys, when you're having uncertain thoughts, when you're having a lot of anxiety, I'm gonna invite you to resist the temptation to try to avoid that anxiety. And I'm going to ask you to consider leaning into it and accepting it and trying to make peace with it. And one way to do that we'll talk about quickly, and then we'll have 10 minutes or so for questions. One way to do this is to use something called the Apple technique, okay? Not original with me, developed by some colleagues in the United Kingdom. The Apple technique, and I'll just walk you through it, all caps, APPLE. And I'm glad to send Kristin a PDF that really describes the Apple technique in depth. and then you all can use it. So here it is. The first A is acknowledge, A for acknowledge. So acknowledge means I have an anxious thought, I have a worried thought, I have some uncertainty. Instead of trying to pound it down with a stick like I'm playing a game of whack-a-mole at Chuck E. Cheese, my favorite game. I don't know if anybody's played that. I doubt we'll be going to Chuck E. Cheese anytime soon, many of us. But instead of trying to knock it down like whack-a-mole, when I feel that anxious thought, I'm going to acknowledge it. I'm going to be aware of it. I'm going to attend to it, and I'm going to acknowledge it. The first P in Apple is simply, I'm going to pause. I'm just going to stop for just a second, and I'm going to pause, and I'm going to say to myself, Jim, Kristin, whatever, I don't need to react to this upsetting, anxious thought. And I certainly don't need to overreact to it. I'm acknowledging it, and I'm pausing and reminding myself that I don't need to really react to it. The second P, pull back, okay? I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to remind myself, thoughts are just thoughts. Thoughts aren't facts. And for some of us, just honestly, for some of us, that alone is a revelation, right? What? Thoughts are thoughts, right? Thoughts aren't facts. Just because I'm worried about this doesn't mean it's actually going to happen, right? Just because I'm worried that I can't handle it doesn't mean that I can't, right? Exactly. It doesn't mean that. Doesn't mean that at all. Thoughts are thoughts. Thoughts aren't facts. So acknowledge, push the pause button for just a second, choose not to overreact, and then pull back. Again, this isn't super easy to do, not as simple as it sounds, but you can get good at it over time. The L in Apple is, I'm going to let it go. I'm acknowledging the anxious thought. I'm going to pause. I'm going to pull back. And then I'm going to kind of imagine a cloud, lovely cumulus cloud. I think Kristin's father-in-law was a meteorologist or a weather researcher, if I remember. So my weather analogy is probably not the greatest, but I'm going to see a cumulus cloud, and I'm going to kind of envision it floating away in the distance. I'm going to let that anxious thought go, right? Not going to try to push it away, not going to take a hammer and try to pound it hard. I'm going to let it go. And then E, I'm going to explore, meaning I'm going to feel the floor under my feet. I'm going to look at the walls around me. I'm going to feel the ground. I'm going to watch the birds, whatever. And I'm going to realize in this moment that I'm okay. I'm okay in this moment. That's the Apple technique. And over time, that approach can be really effective in helping you cope with anxiety. There are two approaches. They're a little bit different here, and I'll wrap up on this, but I think this is important, right? So when we're dealing with anxiety and uncertainty, approach one would be, we're going to eradicate it, right? We're going to take some napalm and we're going to drop it from a plane, and we're going to, try to burn it down, so to speak. But anxiety often doesn't respond very well to that. Okay. And in this pandemic era, the idea that we are going to be able to just blithely choose not to be anxious is probably not very realistic. Okay. Now, some of us will be more than others for a lot of reasons, right? But none of us will be able to just paintbrush over the anxiety. So the better approach number two, is I'm going to find a way to live with it. I'm going to find a way to live with the uncertainty. I'm going to be letting it go, continually trying to, but I'm going to recognize, and this is this is the really important part. I'm going to recognize that even as the uncertainty about my future is there, even the uncertainty about my income is there, even as the uncertainty about when I'm going to return to work, even as that's there, I can choose to be okay. All right. So the idea is not either or. This is the key. It's both and. So here's what we don't want to do. Okay. I am not going to be okay. My world is not going to be okay. Things are not going to be okay for me until the pandemic ends in this particular way, right? That is setting yourself up for failure, right? A far better way is to say, I don't love this. I don't like it. Who would want this? This is where I am. And I'm going to find a way to be okay, even as this distress is swirling. And those are really different. And that's an approach that will sustain you not only now, but that's an approach that will sustain you for your lifetime. So, Kristin, that's what I've got to say. I'm glad to entertain any questions or comments that people have, if there are any.
Can you give us a little example of, I love the idea of leaning in. Talk to us a little bit more about that and give us sort of an example of what that looks like.
Yeah, so I think thanks, Kristin. And people on the call here are doing that more or less, right? Like some people are oriented that way. Some people are very much not that way. So part of what it means, I think, is it means as soon as I have an anxious thought, I'm not going to automatically move into trying to distract myself away from it, right? Which is what we're prone to do. So let's not turn the music up, right? Let's not turn the TV on. Let's not get out a bag of potato chips, as I'm prone to do, and suddenly realize, oh my gosh, that was like 8 ounces. It's all gone, right? Let's not do that. Let's sit with that. Let's sit with that. And let's make a concerted effort not to do things to try to shed these uncomfortable feelings, but rather to sit in them. Now, it might be that as you're starting to dip your toe in the pool, some of us can sit with anxiety for about 14 seconds, right? It's something you practice, but it's something you get better at. And stated another way, it's about choosing not to avoid these things, right? Because they're going to catch up with you eventually in the same way that driving with a check engine light will. It's going to catch up to you eventually.
Mm-hmm. And it looks like we have a question that asks, what are your thoughts about supporting the child artist during this time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think a couple of things. One, I'm happy to say that currently we believe that children are a little more resilient than we used to think they were, right? And that doesn't mean that they're not going to be affected by this. I think children will be quite traumatized by this, but we actually know that children rebound a little better than the mental health field once thought they did. For instance, there was a way of thinking about things, a couple decades ago where the idea was if a child's been traumatized, they're never going to recover from that. Well, we know now there are children who can be exposed to trauma and they can recover beautifully from that. They can be like a flower, growing up in the middle of a sidewalk, recover beautifully. So that's one. I think trying to figure out what children need and trying to meet their needs is really important. And when I say that, what I mean is trying not to project what our own anxieties and needs are on those children, really finding out what they need, right? I have some worries about my kids right now, but those worries actually might not apply to those kids at all, right? So leaning into the lives of these kids, asking them what they're concerned about, trying to give them factual answers that are calming and reassuring, all those things are important. Recognizing that there are things that might cause you to be worried that you can shield children from, and that's probably quite appropriate, right? And being mindful, if you're able, of not passing your anxiety on to them. Those are quick comments I would make.
Mm-hmm. Okay, until we get a question, I would love to hear, we talked a little bit last week about what you're seeing at the hospital. Sure. And like what's going on, like sort of on the ground. I feel like because we hear so much news and so much of it just feels like it's, I don't know. Tell us what's really happening.
Yeah, right. So I'm, of course, I'm a psychologist and not an epidemiologist, but I think, I was just on a call with a few physicians today. And so I think there's no question that locally, at least, in Nashville, things are slowing down, if you will. I mean, we admittedly never had the surge that Detroit and New Orleans and other places did, and things are certainly slowing down, meaning new cases are doubling at a much lower rate. And so people are really encouraged about that, and they should be. But I think what that does psychologically is, I think it introduces, and maybe some of you guys have been living with this, it introduces a brand new set of challenges which are more related to what might be called living with uncertainty, right? So before, when we were fully in lockdown mode, if you will, adrenaline was rushing and the rules were really clear, right? Stay at home, don't go out. And I think we understood that by and large. I mean, whatever people's, particular political bent might or might not be, I think people understood those guidelines pretty clearly. They were red lines. Well, now we're entering psychologically into a little different phase, right? Where, well, it's still here, but maybe not as much as it was. Will it come back? Will it not? Right? So there's more uncertainty. And in some ways, trying to figure out how to negotiate uncertainty for many of us is a lot harder, right? It's a lot harder. So for me as a dad, just for example, it was really easy when we were in the throes of this to say, hey, kids, you're not going anywhere, right? And they didn't push back too much because they were reading the news, right? They knew what was going on. Well, now the lines are about to get a little bit grayer, right? So now I suddenly don't necessarily know what to do, and it's harder. Here's the analogy I would use. So I work with a lot of veterans who served in combat in Iraq or Afghanistan. And in Iraq and Afghanistan, they develop a set of behaviors that people call battle mind. Battle mind. Battle mind is, I'm really aggressive, I'm hypervigilant all the time, I'm on high alert all the time, I'm running on adrenaline all the time, I'm driving down the middle of the road, right? And it doesn't sort of matter that I'm following traffic signals. This is battle mind, right? So you come back to the United States, well, we're not in a battle here, right? So if you maintain battle mind, it doesn't work too well for you, right? You have to adapt. And a lot of us have been in battle mind for a while, right? We've been in battle mind, locked down, hunkered down, hypervigilant, and battle mind is harder to sustain over 6 months, over a year. So I think this coping with transitions is going to be really hard. If people are interested, I'm giving an hour-long talk with a colleague of mine from Johns Hopkins next week, and the whole talk is called Coping with Uncertainty. Now, some of it will be for a healthcare audience, but a lot of it I think would be broadly applicable. It's free. So I can send Kristin a link, and if you want to join and hear Dr. Megan Hosey and I talk about coping with uncertainty, we would welcome that. You don't have to present your nursing card or your doctor badge. You can just join. It's free, and I think it could be helpful.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions? I understand there's actually a raise your hand function.
Kristin, this is Midori. I don't have a question, but I did want to make a comment. And I first want to thank Dr. Jackson for your talk and presentation today. And I think you did hit the nail on the head about this coping with uncertainty.
Right.
Because I think that's sort of the stage that I've been thinking as we look at the city opening up and our individual workplaces returning back to some semblance of normalcy, is we're all going to have to deal with the fact that we have a new normal.
Exactly.
And what does that kind of look like for us? Because I don't think we're ever going to go back to how things were completely.
Right. Yes.
And I think it does create a tremendous amount of, well, how do I function in this new paradigm that I'm not familiar with?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's really interesting. I went into my office isn't at Vanderbilt Medical Center. It's in another building on the campus. But getting into the hospital now, actually, if you don't have COVID, is like trying to break into Fort Knox. They don't really want you there, and I don't want to be there, if I don't need to be there. But I was at my office yesterday. I had not been back to my office hardly at all, and and it felt familiar. I was in the office looking out the window, and it felt kind of familiar. And for a second, I thought, wow, May 1st is almost here. This is going to be so great. It's just going to be back to normal. And that was pretty fine with me. And then I kind of remembered, no. It's not going to be quite back to normal. And I actually felt, Dory, I felt kind of sad about that for a moment, right? So I think that's right. And I think it's important to give ourselves some grace to figure out how to negotiate a new normal. I think some of us are going to do some grieving because we really liked the way that things were before. And some of us are going to do some growing. There's a concept called post-traumatic growth, and I'll mention it here. I think it's worth briefly talking about. So I've mentioned a few country songs here. I know you guys are not, acting in country music videos, right? I get that. So please forgive me. But there was a famous song by Alan Jackson some years ago, Tim McGraw, excuse me. And in the song, it talks about a man who is diagnosed with cancer, if anybody remembers this song. And then he goes skydiving, right? And Rocky Mountain climb, and he becomes the man he always used to be, loves deeper, speaks sweeter. Anyway, you get the point. So that's what people call post-traumatic growth. That is, I've encountered a difficult situation. I've been immersed in some stressors, and sometime in the middle of that, it's worked in some deep places in my life, and it has contributed to growth that otherwise wouldn't have occurred. And some of you, even now, but if not now, eventually, you're going to experience some degree of growth, and it's going to be really meaningful. And that growth could be, wow, I'm recognizing that at the end of the day, it's the people in my life that mean the most, and I didn't realize that as much. Or it may be you're going to realize, oh my gosh, when I look back on this, I'm even stronger than I thought I was. Wow, what are the implications of that, right? You're going to grow. And I think that's a good goal. But often that growth doesn't happen until after you do a little grieving, and those can go together, right? And there is a lot to grieve, right? There's a lot to grieve. And I would encourage you to give yourself permission to feel sad about this, and to recognize that vulnerability and courage, as I said, are two sides of the same coin. The other thing I would mention quickly is that some of you, and I'd love to know, I'm curious, who is a performer and who is leading teams and all those sorts of things. But some of you on this call are presumably leading people, right? Leading people, and so I think this notion that one effective way to lead right now, even though it seems counterintuitive, is to be vulnerable about your own struggles. I think that's a really important observation. And what I have found, and what the literature would support, is that this British, nothing against the UK, by the way, and I'm a big fan of the UK, but this British sort of, I'm gonna lead with a stiff upper lip, right? And I'm gonna grit my teeth and make sure that you don't see that I'm struggling, and that's the leadership model. If it ever was that way, that's not the model in my way of thinking that we want to embrace right now. I think a healthier model, if you're leading teams, is to acknowledge your own struggles, and in doing that, you're giving people permission to own their own struggles and to struggle too, right? And you're working to create a climate with your influence that gives people permission to struggle. And I think that's really, really healthy. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. This next question is, this is a good one. What do you recommend? Do you recommend anything for people and for students who have lost like special events? Like things like the kids who aren't graduating, or the actor that, their entire show now was canceled. and dealing with that kind of loss.
I think it's a huge issue. And I think the main thing that I would just reiterate is don't minimize the difficulty of that, right? I mean, don't talk yourself out of how painful that is, in some cases, how disappointing that is, or perhaps even how devastating it is. A year from now, 2 years from now, it might not feel that way. Very likely might not, right? But in the moment, it does. So owning it and acknowledging it, and to your point, Kristin, not leaning away from it, but leaning into it, I think it's really important. And considering talking to other people that you love, that love you, about how you're feeling about it, it's really important. I've referenced Brené Brown. Has anyone read her stuff? I've recommended her so much. I kind of wish that, many other people have too. I wish she would give me $1 or something for every. I don't know her, but Brené Brown is she's quite a famous researcher. She has a very famous TED Talk about vulnerability that would be worth watching. Somebody's nodding their head. Maybe they've seen it. Emily, have you seen it? Yeah, powerful podcast about vulnerability and the power of vulnerability. But she has written quite a number of really powerful books, and they're all about developing the courage to acknowledge and live in sadness, hard places, to own difficult things, all under the heading of let's own our own stories, right? This pandemic is part of our story. And for some of us, the story during the pandemic might be a story of thriving, might be a story of triumph. For some of us during this pandemic, our story is going to be a story of great sadness and loss. But let's find a way to own our stories, right? Because there are stories. The other comment that I would make, and Kristin, somebody made a comment about that they offered a famous quote in the chat about the power of art. I'm trying to find that. I don't see that quote now, a very eloquent quote, but here's one thing that I probably failed to share that I think is really important. So when we are in traumatic situations and difficult times, research would say that one thing that minimizes the impact of trauma to a great extent is the presence of meaning. So Viktor Frankl, do some of you know Viktor Frankl? Famously wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And Viktor Frankl pointed out and lived out that if you have a why, you can deal with almost any what, right? Like if you have a way to find meaning in something, you can survive a lot, right? So I think this notion expressed in this quote, this notion that the work you guys do is really meaningful during a pandemic, before a pandemic, after a pandemic, that some of the painful emotional lessons that you're learning right now may one day be the fuel for great creativity for you, right? May one day be the fuel for powerful empathy for you that perhaps you didn't have before, that will cause other people to relate to you. If you're able to accept that paradigm and in so doing find meaning in this current situation, that is going to be a great help to you, and that is going to bolster your immunity, if you want to think of it that way, against trauma to a great extent. So you're digging into your experiences, acknowledging that they are creating meaning for you, and acknowledging that what you do is really valuable. It's hugely valuable. And I think that insight and that perspective is really important. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I would commend you guys. I would commend this book to you, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It's just a thin little book. You could probably read it in a night or a day. Really powerful about how to find meaning in suffering and meaning in struggle. And if you can frame this situation is one that's generating some meaning, and remember how meaningful you are. That's going to help you.
Very good. Okay, there's one final question. Any suggestions for sleeplessness or restless sleep during this time? I hear that's a very common thing that's happening right now.
Oh my gosh. I was going to say it's really hard because I'm having that, most every night, maybe not last night. So I think to try to normalize that is important. I mean, it's part and parcel of this anxious time we find ourselves in. I mean, there are practices that psychologists recommend, general practices related to sleep hygiene, simple things like try to go to sleep at the same time every night. And if you're awake after a long period of time, don't just stay in bed, get up and try to do something productive and then go back to bed. I mean, there are some simple techniques. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But I think the main thing is not to minimize it, but to normalize the fact that a lot of people are having problems sleeping right now. I will say this. I will say that to the extent that, that's it, man, search for meaning. To the extent that sleeping problems might be driven by anxiety, and to the extent that anxiety would really be worsening, there are mental health professionals around the world who are ready and available to help you. And I would encourage you to consider talking to someone if you're really struggling. There was a time in Nashville when finding a mental health provider to do telehealth was really difficult. That they just none of them really did it. Now, to try to find one who doesn't, right, is the challenge, right? I don't think you could see somebody in person if you wanted to, right? So there are telehealth providers available in town, around the world, and they can offer help. And here's what I would say. Some of you have been in therapy, some of you haven't, but the fears that many of you might have about therapy, those are not things that people are going to want to enact with you now. So if you're scared about somebody telling you to lay down on a couch and start free associating about your mom and dad or something, that's not what any legitimate psychologist wants to do right now, right? They want to bolster you, they want to help support your defenses, and they want to help you get through this, just as I do. If you do, in fact, want to find a psychologist and you're interested in a referral, if you want to reach out to me through Kristin, or if you want to reach out directly to me, I'm glad to try to help direct you to a resource locally or otherwise. Again, if 100 people ask that, be patient, because that will take me a while. But I can help with that. But if 15 people do, I'm going to be able to get back to you pretty quickly. So the main point is, I really want to help. You guys are delightful. What you're doing is really important. You play a vital role in our community, indeed in our society, and your mental health needs, I suspect, may be overlooked because, as I said, there are not the systems in place to attend to those that there are at healthcare facilities or hospitals. But nurturing these things is very important. And I'm delighted to have had the chance to talk to you a little bit today. And Kristin, please feel free to invite me back if you're inclined, because I'm really happy to help.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's give him a little hand clap here.
Thanks, guys.
Jim, thank you so much for doing this.
Kristin, when you reached out to me, I was so delighted, and I am really glad to help. So, so let me know what I can do, and stay safe, friends. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. Bye. Bye.
We hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. You can find all of our podcasts at tpac.org.